Hey, world history! How are you guys doing today? Hope that you've been having a good weekend. Hope that everything's going well for you guys with school and this crazy season we're in. Just want to resume where we left off. We've been on the Protestant Reformation. We're going to finish that today. You know, I'm just trying to keep us moving along here, and it's kind of sad because there are so many interesting facts we could discuss. It's a fascinating time in history, but I'm just going to try to give us the cliff notes and keep us moving. There's a lot to cover. I want to make sure we get to the next chapters. So today we're going to talk, and as a reminder too, we talked about Luther, then we talked about Calvin, right? We talked about how you had those guys splitting from the Catholic Church. We talked about the Anabaptists, the Radical Reformation last time. So now we're going to move on to England, and we're going to spend more time on England just because as America, you know, our heritage comes from England, but of course, you know, Protestantism, you really have to start with England. So, sorry, American Protestantism, I should say. So today we're going to list England's steps of separation with Rome, discuss the creation of the Anglican Church, discuss the Reformation happenings in Scotland, the Netherlands, France, and discuss the Catholic CounterReformation. Again, that's a lot to cover, so we're going to move pretty quickly. Just check Google Classroom for everything you need. We're testing this week, so just make sure you should have already read the chapter, but make sure you're completely done, because I'm going to say it again. If you want to get a good grade on the test, watch the lectures and read the book. If you don't do those things, then it's pretty obvious. Okay, so England, what's up with England's Protestant Reformation? Well, we know that they didn't really have a specific leader like Calvin or Luther that stood up and made it happen, but instead there was sort of an environment in England that caused them to become Protestant. The publication of English translations of the Bible, this has been happening since Wycliffe. We talked about him back in the day, right? He had already been forcing the Bible to be made in the vernacular for the people to read. And also the involvement of the English rulers. So again, you don't have like you don't have like a priest like Martin Luther standing up and fighting against the Catholic Church. You actually have the rulers of England playing a role, which we'll see what that means in a second. But again, you have a lot of people who are already reading the Bible in English and don't like Roman rule. And you have the leaders themselves that get involved, but not for the most pure of reasons. This man is an interesting fellow. You've probably heard of King Henry VIII. And he is, oh my gosh, he is a great example of a politician. So he's king, right? He hates Martin Luther. He hates Protestantism, and him and his staff put together this great document condemning Martin Luther, condemning Protestantism. The Pope even calls King Henry the defender of the faith. He loves this guy. But then something happens. You see, in this day and age, if you wanted to have your successor be on the throne, you typically wanted to have a male child do it. It was possible to have a female, as we'll see, but there was something about having a male heir that everybody wanted. So he's married to a woman who's not giving him a male heir. So he wants to divorce her. And the Pope says, no, you can't do that. There's no reason for you to divorce her. You know, you don't have any good reasons. So King Henry VIII, the defender of the Catholic faith, says, well, guess what? We're not Catholic. We're Protestant now, so that I can get my divorce. So to be fair and objective here, it's not that the Church of England had the most pure motives for separating from Rome, but that's what happened. So he decides that he wants England to be its own thing. So he appoints Thomas Cranmer to be an archbishop and to start their own church, and they begin the process of making this Church of England. It's not quite finished yet, but it's started. And then I should mention he had 6 wives, and look up the murders of his wives. He killed most of them, and it's pretty bad. Yeah, wasn't very good. And it's funny because like there's a meme I'll pull up right now actually that says even after he was able to divorce, he still killed off his wives just because he was that kind of guy. Yeah, pretty interesting stuff. But King Henry VIII eventually did have the son he was looking for, and that's who comes next, which is King Edward. Sorry, I was supposed to say the 6th. Fix that right now. I can fix it as we do this. King Edward VI becomes the next king of England, right? And he was like his dad. He stayed on the Protestant trajectory. And under his leadership, they came up with a doctrinal statement called the 42 Articles of basically the Christian faith and the Book of Common Prayer. These are 2 important documents in the Church of England, and these were formed under King Edward VI's reign. So King Henry VIII started England on the Protestant trajectory, and his son is continuing them on. But sadly, he didn't really live a long life. He got tuberculosis and died. And what ended up happening next was his half-sister, Mary I, who was actually a daughter from King Henry VIII's first marriage, was still alive, and she was able that was technically her job to fill the throne, because that's who was next in the succession line. Sorry. So Mary I becomes the next ruler, and she was a devout Roman Catholic. This is bad news for Protestants. So what happens is she's immediately goes to work persecuting Protestants, making England Catholic again, and she kills several hundred famous Protestant leaders. Several flee to France and to Switzerland to get away from her, because she's intense, to say the least. Her name is Bloody Mary. That's her nickname, because she's killing off all the Protestants and trying to force England to be a strong Catholic nation. But sadly for Mary, she was married to Philip I of Spain, and they could not have a surviving child. So she died without having an heir to the throne. So then the throne goes to her half-sister, Elizabeth I. By the way, I'm sorry if it's complicated, there's a lot of names. I'm not going to test you in the order of all these by any means. But Elizabeth I becomes the next ruler in line. And Elizabeth I is a strong Protestant. So she revives Protestantism, and that's when the Church of England really becomes solidified. The Church of England as an institution is founded. And it's also called the Anglican Church. And you remember we talked about England, the Anglos and the Saxons, right? Angles and the Saxons, so Anglican, English, Angleland, yeah. So the Anglican Church is just another way of saying the Church of England. By the way, I don't think anybody in this class is Anglican, but if you were to see, the Anglican Church is huge today. There's over 100 million people in it. If you've ever seen an Episcopalian church, that's the American branch of the Anglican Church. And there's also a more conservative group called the Anglican Church of North America that's split from the Episcopal Church. I'm a huge fan, actually, and I attend their services sometimes. And I'm Nazarene, and Nazarene and Methodist, we come from Anglicanism, so there's some tie-ins with the Church of England there, too, with even the traditional part of it. But under Elizabeth I, the Church of England is created as an institution. The monarch, believe it or not, is considered the head of the church. There's like this weird church and state marriage in the Church of England to this day, and it's kind of weird for us as Americans to understand. That's how they do it. The 42 articles were condensed to the 39 articles, which is what they are to this day. They're still follow the 39 articles. And so the Church of England, as we know it, was solidified under Elizabeth's reign. Now, across the English Channel, though, or south, I should say, anyways, not France, but down to Spain, Philip II of Spain was not happy with this whole thing. He was married again to Bloody Mary, and they didn't have any kids. So Philip was trying to figure out a way to make England a Catholic nation. Philip, again, Spain is a strong Catholic nation. They want England to also be a Catholic nation. So he tries to woo Elizabeth I and marry her, but it doesn't work, and she conspires against him the whole time. And so he even tries a conspiracy to get Mary, Queen of Scots, Mary Stuart. He wants to try to get her to basically to do this coup to overthrow Elizabeth and have Mary, Queen of Scots, take the English throne and make England Catholic. But sadly for Mary Stuart, the plot is discovered and she is executed. So they did not have that conspiracy work out too well. And after this, so Philip II tried marrying Elizabeth, he tried wooing her, he even tried overthrowing her. So finally he said, that's it, we're just gonna have to pummel them into submission. So the Spanish had this legendary fleet called the Spanish Armada, right, during this time. This is the late 16th century. And so they equipped all their ships to cross the English Channel and go to war with England. So in 1588, they were going to force England to be a Catholic nation. But sadly for the Armada, a few things worked against them. Number one, England had smaller ships that were pretty maneuverable. So they could maneuver around these big Spanish galleys and these huge ships that took forever to turn. The smaller ships could maneuver around them and shoot them and bring them down. Sir Francis Drake is a famous captain and who discovered large, he's been, I shouldn't say this here, but he's visited much of the world. There's the Drake Passage in South America, you may remember from geography last year. But he was commanding them and did a really good job. And then to make things worse, when the Spanish headed up north, this crazy strong wind came in and blew and most of their ships into the ground anyway and destroyed them. So that wind has been called the Protestant wind, because it really helped the Protestants. And Spain gave up after that, and England would stay Protestant, and Spain would just continue on their Catholic trajectory. One thing worth mentioning too is, so after England becomes officially a Church of England, it's a really interesting sort of group, because here you have a Queen Elizabeth and you had her staff, and so they want to be Protestant, but you have a large chunk of Catholics in England who want to be Catholic. So they had this merger compromise thing, and that's why whenever you visit an Anglican or an Episcopalian church, you almost feel like you're in a Catholic church. It's a lot of the Lord be with you and also with you. It's a lot of reader response stuff. It's a very high Eucharist or high view of the communion. It's a lot of stand up, sit down. Now, they don't follow the Pope. They don't follow a lot of Catholic doctrines, but the feel is very similar to the Catholic Church. So there were some in England who didn't really want to be part of the state church, or they at least wanted to change it. Going back to probably 5th grade right now, the Puritans were English people who wanted to stay in the Church of England, but they wanted to purify it. They didn't want it to be so Catholic-y. And then you had the Separatists, and these are the people who wanted to separate from the Church of England and have their own church completely. This is where we get, by the way, a lot of the Baptist churches. The Baptist church as we know it was founded during this whole era, where people began to have local autonomous churches and that were not connected to the church or to the larger church or to the state, having their own independent churches. This is when this is all going to happen. But again, to remember the difference here, Puritans think purify. They wanted to stay in the Church of England but purify it. Separatists wanted to separate from the Church of England. And then, of course, this is going to play a big role in America, which we'll get to later when they migrate across the pond to America. So that's a lot for England. Thank you for bearing with me on that. Now let's talk very quickly about Scotland, the Netherlands, and France. I'm just going to mention one thing about Scotland. John Knox, who was a Calvinist, founded the Presbyterian Church. He created it. Now, you've probably seen Presbyterian churches. Some of you may be Presbyterian. But all I'm going to say about it is basically they believe in the ideas of John Calvin, so predestination, all that stuff. But you also have a unique form of polity. Polity is a fancy word for church government. And what basically, if you go to the Catholic Church, where does authority reign? Authority is in the Pope and the bishops, right? In the Presbyterian Church, they believe in electing representatives from the churches to get together to determine doctrine. That's Presbyterian polity. So basically, whenever it's time for their conference, all the Presbyterian churches will send their lay delegates or their ordained people. Basically, they'll appoint representatives from each church. They'll congregate together and they'll discuss and figure out new doctrines and new purchases and whatnot. So it's just a particular way of ruling. Episcopal so that's the Presbyterian Church. Churches like the Catholic Church have an episcopal polity, which again means the Pope and the bishops have the ultimate power. Congregational churches is when each local church is in charge of itself. Most of you are probably congregational in this room, I'm assuming. And that's basically where it's a non-denominational church, a lot of Baptist church or all Baptist churches. Basically, the church is self-governing and they call the shots for themselves. The pastor is not under a bishop or under some higher authority. But those are the three main types of church polity: Presbyterian, Episcopal, Congregational. Presbyterian, where churches elect representatives to go vote for them in an assembly. Episcopal, when the bishops above them tell the local churches what to do. Congregational, and each local church rules itself. Okay, moving on. What about the Netherlands? Well, there were a lot of Protestants there, and they were sick of being Catholics, so they got William the Silent to lead them in some uprisings against the Catholics. And they did, in the 1580s, they did win some independence, and which would eventually be finally recognized later in its fullness. But you did have the Protestants win some independence in the 1580s against their Catholic neighbor Spain, mainly. And then what about France? So there's the Huguenots, right? And Huguenot is just a fancy word for French Protestant. They were all Calvinists. Again, they believed the writings of John Calvin, predestination and whatnot. And so there was a lot of fighting because France to this day is a very dedicated Catholic nation. So they didn't really like these Huguenots. They didn't want these Protestants around. So Catherine de' Medici, we talked about the Medici family in Italy, she had a lot of power behind the throne in France. So she orchestrated this massacre on August 27, 1572, which that's in the church calendar, that's considered St. Bartholomew's Day. It's just one of the church holidays that are celebrated by some. But she said, hey, let's invite all these famous Huguenot leaders over to Paris. And then you guys can come out here and we can, sorry, is mine? Okay, sorry, I thought my timer was off. Okay, we're good. So she's like, let's invite all these famous Huguenot leaders to France and we'll just have a chance to reconcile and make things right. That's not what she had in mind, because they all went over there and then she orchestrated a systematic slaughter of all the Protestants. And there's horrible, I'll put a painting up maybe on a pop-up, but you can see this horrible bloody scene where the Catholics slaughtered all the Protestants. And to this day, again, France remained pretty strongly Catholic, even though they did eventually have some toleration. What happened was a guy named Henry of Navarre became king, And he was actually a Protestant, but when he was able to become king and he realized that he was going to be in the minority and he'd face problems, he converted to Catholicism. So he did abandon the Huguenots to become Catholic. But because he had a soft spot in his heart, he passed the Edict of Nantes, which tolerated French Protestants. So you wouldn't see those slaughters anymore. Protestants were allowed to coexist with the Catholics in Spain. I mean in France, sorry. Okay, I know that's a lot. Thank you guys. I'm trying to keep this pretty fast. Okay, the last thing we're going to discuss is the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So the Catholic Church, think about this. You just go back before the 1500s, and they're the only big dog in town. Now all of a sudden there's been all these splits. You have Calvinists and Lutherans, and Anabaptists and Anglicans, and Presbyterians up in Scotland now. What the heck are they going to do? So the Catholic Church gets together and has a chance to try to put their affairs in order. It's called the Counter-Reformation because, again, this is going against the Protestant Reformation. And so they wanted to get rid of some of their more corrupt doctrines. They met at what's called the Council of Trent, which I should have mentioned that earlier, but the Council of Trent is what it's called. But they put things back in order. Simony, which is when they would sell church offices, that was ended. Indulgences were ended. So they ended a lot of the things that were controversial. And during this time, you have the Jesuits created. St. Ignatius of Loyola was a guy who, I really like St. Ignatius, but he had this long history of kind of resisting God, but then he came to know God and became very serious about his faith. He founded an order, kind of like the Benedictines we talked about earlier, but an order of monks called the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. And they were dedicated to suppressing heresy and promoting Catholic doctrine. They did sometimes resort to violence, sadly, just like Protestants did, but they, for the most part, fought intellectual battles. Also, one thing that happened during this time is the Roman Catholic Church established a prohibited list. So basically there were certain books, including Bible versions, that were not allowed to be read. So if you're a good Catholic, you just don't read those books. Kind of like when I was in high school and we weren't allowed to read Harry Potter. That was on our index of prohibited books, sadly. Okay, so, I have it here, yeah. Council of Trent, sorry. Council of Trent was in 1563, and Pope Paul III structured it. So that was pretty much not going to change things too much. They use the word anathema, which means cursed. If anybody says salvation is by faith alone, let him be anathema. Let him be cursed. And in this council, they condemned two key Protestant doctrines, which are sola scriptura and sola fide. And as a reminder, sola scriptura means that the Bible is the only authority. The Catholic Church said, no, the authority rests in the Bible and in church tradition and in the Pope and the doctors. And to be fair on this point, we Protestants, we get on their case about that, but the Catholics do have some good points. Look at the thousands of Protestant denominations. Interpreting the Bible is not very easy, and I can see arguments for their position, having an orchestrated body that's job is to do the interpreting of the Bible to keep everybody bound together. Because in America, we have split, there's thousands of Protestant denominations because everybody interprets the Bible differently. But at the same time, if you only have one person in town interpreting the Bible and telling everybody what to believe, things can get pretty corrupt, which is exactly what happened. Sola fide, it means by faith alone. And they said, no, you have to have faith and works. Whereas Protestants, no, we say it's just by faith. That's how you're saved. It's a great video we don't have time to watch today, but by Robert Barron on print. Okay, and that's a lot, you guys. And I know this is, I really wish we could spend more time on these different parts. I just covered 2 whole sections in that. Thank you again for listening. Let me explain this week. So you just watched the lecture, so good job. You only have 3 real other things to do. There's another primary source assignment, Luther's Freedom of a Christian. I really want you guys to do that because I think it's one of my favorite. I read the whole thing and I loved it. And I'm just going to give you guys some excerpts to read and answer some questions. CNN 10, watch and leave a comment like normal. And do your assessment. That's going to be your second test since we've been online. You probably noticed there's not a discussion. I'm not going to overburden you guys, so just keep it to these 3 things this week. And I was kind of debating between the discussion or the Luther reading, but I'm going to go with the Luther reading because I really want you to read his words. I really think they could even minister to you like they have to me. So lecture, primary source, assignment, CNN 10, and then the assessment. And one last thing with the assessment, again, if you want to get a good grade, watch the lectures and take notes and read the book. Don't go online and try to copy a bunch of sources, or don't try to just research on Google last minute, or you're probably not going to do that well. If you have any questions, let me know. Love you guys, and I will see you soon.